Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. If you have already joined, I would like to now begin by introducing our panel of speakers today. And I'd like to start by introducing Andrew Lumsden. Andrew is a partner at Corrs Chambers Westgarth. Andrew specializes in M&A, securities, transactions, and corporate governance. He advises corporate clients in all aspects of local and cross-border mergers and acquisitions, as well as corporate governance. He has contested and negotiated takeovers, fundraising, and corporate and securities law matters. Andrew has expertise in foreign investment law, real estate, infrastructure, energy, and resource and media. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel today. I'd then like to introduce Phoebe Roberts. Phoebe is a senior associate in the Climate Risk Department at Minter Ellison. Phoebe is a senior associate in the Climate and Sustainability Risk Governance team. She has a background in procurement of major infrastructure and construction projects. She brings an understanding of the complex legal and commercial nature of commercial transactions to climate risk advisory. Phoebe is also the Director of Implementation and the co-lead of the APAC chapter of the Chancery Lane project. And this is a global pro bono initiative of lawyers to rewire contracts and laws to tackle climate change with a mission to see every contract enable solutions to climate change. Phoebe, welcome. Lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Chantal, and hello, everybody.
And then last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Kat Schultz. Kat Schultz is a senior legal writer in our M&A team at LexisNexis. Catherine comes from practice where she was working on a range of cross-border and domestic corporate and commercial transactions. She's previously worked in corporate teams at Baker McKenzie, has experience in private merger acquisitions, reorganizations, and integrations, corporate governance, and commercial transactions. Kat is a regular commentator for LexisNexis on M&A issues and has expertise in private M&A, reorganizations, integrations, corporate governance, and commercial law. Welcome, Kat, to the session today.
Thanks, Chantal. Lovely to be here.
So we're going to start off by getting some engagement from our participants on the call today. We will shortly be putting a poll live. And if technology does what it's meant to do, you should hopefully see that coming through. The poll is up, and what we would like everybody to do is just take a moment to answer those questions in the poll. While everybody is having a look at the question in the poll and answering that, I will set some context for our session today. The poll question: to what extent is your organization thinking about ESG issues as part of your growth strategy? And your options there are not sure, it's taken into consideration sometime, it's a high priority. The answers to the questions are anonymous. You will not be disclosing anything about your organization in answering the question, so please don't feel concerned that anything will be exposed. But if you'd like to go ahead and do that. I am, however, seeing a note just from a technical perspective, host and panelists cannot vote. So just from a technical perspective, if something needs to happen to open up that voting, that would be great. In the meantime, I will kick us off by, there you go. I think that is now coming through. Fantastic. I'm going to start off by setting up a framework around the discussion for today. And then we'll circle back to the polling question and start that off as our conversation. But what we really are going to be covering today in the conversation with the panelists are key concepts and issues to consider in the space, current and predicted future trends, both domestic and overseas, and how are companies able to use M&A to take advantage of ESG opportunities while managing potential risks and get ahead of the curve. More broadly, how can companies and practitioners integrate ESG into every transaction? So in terms of today's conversation and the framing for today's conversation, we want to talk specifically about the relationship and the nexus between ESG and mergers and acquisitions, We know that ESG is an enormous field, and we could spend all day talking about things related to ESG. So we are going to try confine the conversation to the space of M&A for purposes of keeping it contained. But let's have a look at the poll. And interesting results out. It's pretty evenly spread. 38% of people saying not sure, sometimes taken into consideration, 32% of panelists, and a high priority for 30%. So, Kat, I wonder if I can throw to you just for your view on the poll, for kind of some opening thoughts to get this conversation kicked off. Are you surprised by those results? If you can start us off by giving us your thoughts, please.
Sure. I think that's a really interesting set of results, and I know we have a wide variety of organisations and practitioners and business people here on the call today. I think it would be really interesting as well to kind of see where the answer to that question would have been 3 to 5 years ago, and where we see that being another 3 to 5 years in the future. Looking at the potential longer term impacts in this space. So I might open it up to Phoebe and Andrew, in light of those results, I guess, how do you see the drivers ESG affecting transactions in this space, and where do you see those potential longer term opportunities for entities to get involved?
Sure. Do you want me to kick off, Andrew? Or
Sure.
Yeah.
No
Thanks, Kat. So I agree. The results, I think, are interesting. I think the even spread, it's not surprising that, the group on the call today are at varying stages. Some appear to be leading, some still in that phase of understanding what ESG really means for them in their organisation. It does, to me, appear to be sort of indicative of the overall trend with ESG and sustainability, which is that expectations are escalating for corporates in particular, escalating at such a pace of change. I think that is sort of the sort of overarching trend, or the consistent theme with ESG is how quickly things are shifting. And so even those who are at the front of the pack and have it incorporated in their strategy are on this continuous learning journey about how to actually meet those expectations of stakeholders and markets and financial institutions, governments, regulators, etc. I think the question in particular asked, is it part of your growth strategy, which I think is a really, really important part of ESG, and I think lends towards the overall trend that ESG is sort of not an annex anymore to corporate strategy. It's not something that can be kind of bundled away just with the sustainability team, but it is something that squarely now sits with executive decision makers, the risk oversight, strategic oversight of the board, and particularly for climate change as one of the sort of cornerstone key aspects of ESG. It really is about material risks, and material risks that are driving approaches and strategic approaches in responses to those risks. I might pause there and hand over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe. Look, I think it's probably what you'd expect to see. It's kind of that standard bell-shaped demographic split, right? You got, a small number of people who are kind of haven't yet started, a lump in the middle who are trying to work out what it all means, and then the sort of early adopters who are driving it forward, and you'll see them, doing things. And for us, I think probably in an M&A context, that probably fits into a couple of categories. There are, what we're seeing are those that are seeking to decarbonize, for want of a better term, right? So they're looking at high carbon assets as a contagion, particularly to their ESG aspirations. There are those who are seeing essentially the other side of that process. They see they've got more appetite for high carbon assets, and they see them, like one example is, I think that there are varying views around decontamination risks on coal assets, for example, right? And so we see a class of clients who are looking at those assets and saying, well, we've got different views about what that might look like. And the other is sort of those who are looking at, well, how am I going to, you know, how do I put an ESG lens onto my standard M&A strategy, right? So what does that mean? You know, how do I look at my normal run of the mill, for want of a better term, M&A, and then put that ESG lens and say, how comfortable am I that I'm not contaminating my existing position in relation to what I'm trying to do with my organization going forward? And B, can I accumulate, you know, high quality sort of ESG friendly assets and sort of lift myself up? So that's probably how we sort of see it in the spectrum of the client contacts we have in the space.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really, really great introduction. Before I move on with the follow-up question for all of the panelists, if anybody has a question that they would like to pose to anyone on the panel, please feel free to make use of the Q&A feature within Zoom. I will be monitoring those for questions. So if there is anything you'd like to ask of any of our panelists, please do so via that function. Okay, so I think Andrew and Phoebe, what you've just said, and Phoebe, you spoke about the expectations that are escalating. So I think really great to have a conversation about how is ESG driving M&A activity. Andrew, you've mentioned a little bit already about how that is being impacted in certain industries about, you know, contaminated assets. But let's dig into that a little bit deeper. How is it driving M&A activity? Which industries are exposed? And where are long-term potential opportunities for organizations looking at the space of M&A in a sort of broad sense and the impact of ESG? So I'm going to let you start off, Andrew, with that. And then
Sure.
Phoebe, if you could follow on, please.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I alluded to what we're seeing at the moment. Again, I think it is very much an evolving space. And particularly, you know, and I'm sure Phoebe will talk to it as well, but, you know, like, frankly, a huge amount of the focus at the moment is on E. And I think the S&G bit is still kind of really trailing a long way behind. And if you look at, you know, what's happening in terms of international reporting and, you know, greenwashing, etc., thus far, it's very kind of E focused. And the E is even probably more narrowly focused, right? So we're not seeing a really high focus on sustainability. What we are seeing is a really strong focus on basically decarbonisation. There's an overweight of focus in the space on this particular issue that's driving a lot of public attention. I think, you know, with COP coming up and all of the other things that's going on, that is not surprising. But I think as time goes by, we will start to see a lot more focus across the group, across the whole of that category, and what that means. I think that probably, you know, as I said to you, I think, you know, the carboning and decarboning is still kind of a lot of what we see in terms of what's in the market. But I suspect that there will be, you know, a lot more focus on issues like sustainability, a lot more focus on, you know, the social aspects of what we're trying to talk about. For example, you know, a better and deeper understanding of issues like modern slavery, right? You know, where you're, you know, the capacity to drill back into supply chains is coming up. I think that has been a case where vendors have not previously, or vendors or purchasers have not previously done a lot of work in terms of unpacking those supply chains. So off the back of the COVID, step one, I think, there's been a lot more focus on supply chain. But I think in the ESG space, you're seeing people really starting to try and get a much better understanding of those supply chains and what are the risks and opportunities in that.
Yeah, and Phoebe, just for you to follow on, are you seeing that in the space that you operate, particularly around climate and the E still being predominantly where the focus is, and how do you think that is shifting into focusing on, you know, to Andrew's point, the social and governance components of you know, in M&A?
Yeah, absolutely. So agree with everything that Andrew's mentioned. I think particularly with climate and, you know, social matters, but also nature and biodiversity and Indigenous perspectives, all of these issues are interrelated and impact on one another and can't be unwound. So I think that is sort of the starting point with ESG issues, is that you can't really deal with one or manage one well without managing the others as well, and taking an approach which also addresses those key issues in particular, I think is the starting point. And I think just in response to the point about sort of climate being the focus area, it's absolutely correct, Andrew. And I mean, that's not a news flash for anyone on the call. It's all that we can sort of hear about at the moment. And I do think that is because of the criticality of where we are at the moment in terms of levels of warming and what the science is telling us in the imperative to decarbonise. But also, as I mentioned earlier, all of these economic transition risks in terms of how you know, climate risks are being priced, how the banks are now you know, aligning their lending investment portfolios. What this means is that, you know, the weight of money is green now, and so investors, banks are looking to align their investment and lending practices with sustainability linked outcomes. And so I think if we're looking at M&A in particular from that either top down sort of strategic and bottom up approach, those drivers are, you know, really ensuring that climate is the sort of the main issue. But as we've mentioned, I mean, we can't address climate without addressing the other issues in E&S. From the bottom-up perspective, rather than being a driver of M&A activity, I think something that often gets forgotten is that ESG is fundamentally a risk issue, and in the last few years in particular, a significant financial and liability risk issue. So it should be considered alongside every other material risk in every transaction as one of the sort of core areas of the diligence process. And in particular is not a tick box exercise. It's not about whether there's compliance with the Modern Slavery Act, you know, environmental approvals and you know, environment planning laws, tick, tick, tick. You know, and have we got good governance structures, tick, tick, tick. But really about how the organisation, the target or whatever the situation might be, is approaching a very dynamic risk issue. And that ESG doesn't need to be the driver of the deal, but alongside decarbonisation, climate risks bring significant physical risks. So it might be that you're purchasing a factory, manufacturing assets, for example, that could be particularly vulnerable to physical risks of climate change. And are you asking the right questions? So that factory could have ticked off all of the environmental boxes, but have you actually, you know, dug a little bit deeper to see that, to assess the integrity of the asset, where it's located, what its vulnerabilities are, you know, how that asset is going to stand up in a low carbon world. I might hand over to Kat.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's all really interesting, Phoebe. And in terms of something that I think about is in terms of how you, like, when we're talking about emissions, when we're talking about decarbonisation, I think it's easier to quantify some of those risks in terms of, you know, the sort of the metrics that are available, the data that's available. Whereas you're looking at more of the S&G, you know, it's definitely it's qualitative risks as opposed to sort of the pure numerical side of things. You know, I guess I'd be interested from a due diligence process, and maybe Andrew, you can speak to this, is in terms of the difference between some of those more sophisticated buyers, you know, private equity, who are really interested in what's happening in this space and how they might be interacting with organizations that are perhaps, you know, still earlier in their journeys, you know, and how you kind of manage that disparity when you're coming at it from a transactional lens.
Yeah, look, there's a little piece I've just done on the Cause website, which is goes into this in some detail, but I think at a high level that Phoebe's right, that it's very risk focused, right? I think, and there are a number of elements to that. One of which is, you know, what does the sort of business look like, and what are the impacts of adverse ESG outcomes on the business going forward? And again, I think that is because, you know, the G doesn't get a lot of a focus, but, you know, I think one of the things you've seen off the back of things like the Banking Royal Commission is that you could be quite happily been ticking around in the kind of financial planning space, for example, and if you were acquiring or investing in that sector without understanding kind of some of the embedded governance issues that were there that weren't being well understood, and you weren't drilling into, do these structures motivate the right outcomes in terms of what I'm looking for in my business more generally? And I think certainly, as I say, I mean, I think our experience is probably entirely reflective of what we saw in the study. Right? There are those who are, you know, have a burning passion for this topic, and they have devoted resources. They have their own teams. They have specialists that they're prepared to turn onto this stuff from a DD perspective. And there are those that it doesn't even raise a mention, and you have to kind of, I wouldn't say kicking and screaming, but you've got to drag them that this is an issue, right? That these in this market, there are real issues here, and they can have a contagion effect on your primary business. And I think, you know, and I'm be interested what the sort of audience is saying, but I think we are starting to see sources of capital. Now, initially much more on the equity side, but I don't suspect it will be long before you'll see these issues emerge from the debt side as well. And because as their reporting obligations increase in terms of, you know, generally reporting on ESG, I mean, at this stage, again, it's kind of climate focused, but it's come, you know, the ISSB S2 standards out there, and people are working and talking about it. As that pressure rises, a lot of people are going to be reporting on this stuff, and they're going to want data sets, right? And so at a minimum, they want to understand the issues.
So, Andrew, that's really interesting. And just keeping with this due diligence process, we've got two questions from the audience, which are both, you know, I think really good to cover at the stage. And I'm going to just invert them a little in the order that they came through, because in keeping with due diligence, I'm going to address Carolyn's question first, which I think is a great one and a good one to discuss while we're talking about due diligence. The question is, many M&A failures have been driven by a lack of culture, due diligence, identifying lack of fit, work health, safety issues already in the business, etc. The S in ESG is about the people. And the question from Carolyn is, are M&A teams looking to identify early risk in the culture, social, work context, psychological safety in an M&A context? Great question, Carolyn.
I've actually can bore on this subject for days, but I think she's right on the money, right? What I would say, more M&A have failed as a result of culture fit than have failed as a result of the sort of financial. But ultimately, and that's a two-way street, right? It's not just, it's how do the two cultures fit, right? It's not just is the company I'm buying got the wrong culture, but, you know, for example, if you acquiring an organization that's gone a long way down the ESG and has a very aggressive set of metrics about how they're measuring that stuff, and you're trying to fold that into an organization who are only kind of at the beginning of the journey, and they say, well, we don't do things like that, you know, you could see that ending in tears pretty quickly. And I frankly think it's still kind of a big issue in M&A that's pretty undercooked, and that we don't, you know, there's a lot of focus on the widgets, which is bizarre because most of the business we buy, that, you know, of what we see in this country, they're mostly, the capital's going up and down in the lifts, right? It's not sitting in widgets in boxes, right? But there's a the acquisitions team seem a lot more comfortable with the boxes and the widgets than they do with the people. So I think it's generally underdone, and I suspect it may be one of those things that, you know, and like we've seen with the COVID, like you end up with it puts a lens on a thing, and I think this might be one of those lensing issues where people are going to go, oh, we might do that better next time.
Yeah. So, Phoebe, I might then throw David's question to you off the back of what Andrew has just said about the difference between focusing on widgets and boxes versus, you know, I like David's way of describing, you know, what's moving in the lifts. So David has posted a question to say, does it always drive profit, or is there a risk for losing profits in the way in which these things are managed? And I think this is a great time to talk about that, given the comment that Andrew has just made about focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the starting point in answering David's question is that to kind of take it back to the core duties, core directors' duties around maximising profits for shareholders, discharging due care and diligence, acting in the best interests of the company. And I think through that lens, I think it's often sort of rudimentary to think that you're investing in an ESG aligned business, which so therefore might not be very much profitable enough. We're investing in this business because it's the right thing to do and we want to do the right thing here. But actually, I think that conversation has moved on quite squarely, that it's about risks and opportunities, and that making poor choices around the companies that you might invest in really can have serious commercial repercussions. So, for example, if you have stated to the market a very ambitious net zero policy and your financial institution has your corporate financing, for example, contingent on that trajectory, which I should state again, all the banks have signed up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance that commits them to aligning their entire lending and investment portfolio with a Paris-aligned pathway to net zero, with interim targets to 2030 for their high emitting sectors, which includes, you know, power generation, oil and gas, of course, thermal coal, but commercial real estate, for example, is another one of those high emitting sectors, iron and steel. Your corporate financing or your ability to meet those targets, which you've stated to the market, could be really hindered by the choices that your, you know, corporate advisory teams might enter into. Your corporate development teams have got their shiny new deal they've put forward to you, but it really, you need to be taking a really holistic approach in, yes, is there a good commercial decision here? Is this going to drive profits and contribute to the overall success of the organisation? But also, are you opening yourself up to a greenwashing claim because now you're not going to meet those targets? Linking back to the public company also around continuous disclosure requirements around those targets as well. Some of the considerations that I think looking at ESG purely is the right thing to do sometimes undermines these concepts and these considerations for organisations when they are, you know, at the no-go stage of their diligence process. And I think really shifting, as I've mentioned a few times, shifting the focus away from, you know, this is something that we want to do because it's the right thing, to this is a good financial opportunity, strategic opportunity, and framing it through that risk and opportunity lens.
Yeah, and I guess just to underline that, I think talking about, you know, the opportunity lens to it, or sort of from the risk perspective as well, you know, is there an element from that, you know, public perception side of things? It's sort of not just about what you are doing, but what you're seen to be doing, or what you're, you know, seen not to be doing, you know, in that space. So I think sort of on the greenwashing side of things, I know that ASIC has recently, you know, sort of just done their first enforcement action around this. You know, Phoebe, are you sort of expecting that we're just going to keep seeing, you know, an increased focus from the regulators in this space?
Oh yeah. It is the very sexy and exciting topic for 2022 for both ASIC and the ACCC. I know last year we had the Section 912C notices that were issued to a number of the super funds to demonstrate, you know, their to sort of back up the credentials in relation to the claims they were making about their green funds, and to ensure that there was sort of a robust process that sat behind those claims. ASIC, similarly now, there's they're doing an internet sweep, they're calling it, of claims, for a whole range of organisations, and is particularly an enforcement focus for them. It's also been just in the past couple of days, as COP27 is kicking off, a really core focus of the discussions at COP. I think one of the quotes I saw today is it's not about cutting corners, it's about cutting emissions. So there's been a new UN report released in relation to greenwashing. And again, it's really about ensuring, and particularly from ACCC's perspective, protecting consumers in particular from making investment choices, particularly with financial products, that they assume are aligned with their values, assumed are aligned with what they want to invest in, but are really just a bit of green, sort of fluffy around the outside. So I think definitely, and it's just really about ensuring that there's sort of a robust, you've got good, reasonable grounds for making your claims. I think one point to mention in particular about net zero targets is they are a statement about a future matter. And so in relation to misleading and deceptive conduct laws, there are special rules that apply to future matters, which means that you need to have a reasonable basis for making that claim and have a genuine intention for pursuing that target. So if you're unable to demonstrate those both of those criteria, you leave yourself open to a misleading deceptive conduct claim, which no loss actually has to have taken place. No one actually has to be misled or deceived for there to be a claim for misleading deceptive conduct. And probably should have mentioned this at the start, that there's no new laws. I think most people on the call here are actually lawyers. There's no new laws in relation to greenwashing. It's just your very classic misleading deceptive conduct laws under the ACL, ASIC Act, Corps Act. Just with a very new context, which is sustainability and climate related claims. And with this enforcement focus from ASIC, organisations can have as little as 2 weeks to back up their claims. So you get the letter from ASIC and you'll need to respond within a very short window to how you've substantiated your claim.
Yeah. So Phoebe, you mentioned, and Andrew, I'm going to just throw a question to you off the back of something Phoebe had said. You spoke about, and I wrote down the words that you used, serious commercial repercussions where risks and opportunities are not weighed up in a meaningful way by organizations. So Andrew, are we able to, for people on the call going, okay, what does this actually mean? What are the things I need to know about? Can we focus a little on what boards need to be considering and how advisors can best support different clients in the space? So there's some specifics that you're able to call out to say, well, these are the things that I think are critical to consider and to bear in mind in the space. Just, we can't hear you, Andrew, if you could just...
Sorry.
Right.
It's one of those, unfortunately, it is a very horses for courses kind of thing. And, if you're buying a coal mine, the things you're going to think about are going to be very different from the things if you're buying a shopping center. But, I think that the issues are now of such a magnitude that you need to have a kind of a wider lens in terms of what you're trying to look at. So just thinking about, things like shopping centers right now, it used to be the case that, really a shopping center owner wouldn't think too much about, they might think about tenant mix, they might think about who's in there and what does it look like, right? But they might not have turned their mind to, seems to be a lot of nail bars. What's going on there? Who are the people running that? How do I get comfort that the people there are all properly visaed and working under proper conditions, right? And that's just one example of a thing, and it really that I think is probably, and I talk about it in the article, is that one of the things is you really need to kind of apply a different lens to how you're looking at individual businesses, right? But I think in terms of the macro, all right, coming back to kind of that director's duty, I mean, you know, the sort of Hartley opinion on climate change, right, which is kind of sort of, I suspect will become the law if it isn't already, right? It's probably LORE now, but I suspect when a prosecution turns up, it's going to look a lot more like LAW law, because this kind of foreseeable risk analysis, right? And essentially what that opinion says, and, you know, I encourage everybody to read it in its various iterations, but the issue there is that if you as a director can look forward and reasonably see an issue emerging, then that should trigger your director's duties, right? This is essentially kind of a red flag. You don't have to get it right? You don't have to be, but what you can't be is ignorant to the issue, right? You have got to have turned your mind on and done the work and come up with a view. And I think, you know, like when you line these things up, right? And unfortunately, the history of these kind of cases is, in terms of director prosecution, it's seldom an event. What happens is that the regulator will come after you, and the cases kind of tend to revolve around a chain of events, which may or may have its culmination in unfortunate. And I think, just again, without kind of drifting into an area where we could bore for days, is the stepping stone piece of this is actually probably, if I was a director, that would be the thing that I would be most concerned about, right? Because the stepping stone cases haven't gone as well for ASIC as they might, but I think, with respect, some of that is because they haven't been as well run as they could. But I think the genesis of that stepping stone liability, if you look at the Casamidas cases, Ros, the company wasn't even found to be in breach, right? That ultimately what had happened was that directors had put the company in a position where it might have been in breach. And now that might cascade right through to kind of basically, you know, reputation issues. And I think Phoebe talked before about, that these things have a way in terms of if you're, if the behaviors that are being adopted and what's going on in an organization is such that you're not just not doing what's legal, but not doing what's right, and that has a cascading impact on share price. You know, I don't think it's out of the realms of possibility that might be a place that it'd go. And that would be, in terms of a director, that piece, I think, is a kind of dangerous piece, that the ESG sets up these kind of rather fuzzy metrics, right? And if you as a director are not alive to how we're going to manage that, you might find yourself liable on a breach of director's duties through the kind of stepping stone issues.
And I think, just to kind of follow on from that, I think, Andrew, one thing you said there was, if you're not sort of alive to how you're going to manage these issues, you know, coming back to that, you know, transactional M&A perspective, like if you're a director and or a practitioner supporting the board, once you've identified there's a risk, how do you actually address it? How do you manage it in practice? And Phoebe, I know sort of the work that you do with the Chancery Lane project in terms of integrating some of these issues into the transaction documents, into kind of the processes around this. We've spoken a bit about due diligence, but I wonder if you could, speak a little bit about how we can actually reflect that in the documentation as well.
Yeah.
And Phoebe, sorry, before you answer that, I just want to tack something onto that, and you could possibly then talk to all of it in one go. We're talking about this kind of, you don't want to be greenwashing, but you also don't want to be caught not having a look at these. So what for a company who has a long way to go, and to Kat's point about documentation, where's the balance between not making promises that you maybe are not able to deliver on, but also doing enough to get a start and to start making headway? Is there a balance? What does that look like?
Great questions. I'll start with yours first, Chantal, because I think it's a good segue from Andrew's question to Kat's question. Would be remiss of me, so thank you, Andrew, for mentioning the Hartley opinions. It would be remiss of me to not mention that Minterell is one of the instructing solicitors on all three of those Hartley opinions, of course, led by Sarah Barker, who's the head of climate risk governance at Minters. And I think just what Andrew's mentioned is absolutely right. And I think what it means is for directors really need to understand, and through that means they need to be receiving really good information, and that means the executive level really needs to understand for their particular organisation what are the particular risk exposures and opportunities in relation to ESG for their company, for their organisation, and what does it mean for them in particular. And that really, that's important, obviously, because they can take a tailored and strategic approach to those risks, but linking that to their director's duty and the standard of care of directors, it's about a reasonable director in those in the subjective circumstances, of the company. So really you need to understand the context of your organisation as the starting point. And really that means capacity building is usually the first step. So directors, management, and those who are feeding information up to the board really need to be on top of key issues. They don't need to know everything, but they need to know what's important for their particular organisation. And then it's about, just like, as I mentioned, every other risk, every other, cyber risk, whatever it might be, it's about weighing up those risks. And then in the discharge of the director's duties, mainly in risk oversight and strategic planning, is feeding those in and feeding it in with your other mix of risks. It's not that ESG is going to be the biggest risk for some organisations. They may have already handled it really well, just how they do business. For others, it's going to be, a really big area that they'll need to focus on. So that is what I would just add to that part of the conversation. And I think that question about balance, Chantal, is really, that's the issue that everyone is grappling with at the moment. Expectations are running far ahead of where organisations are able to meet at this point in time. There's pressures for organisations to be setting net zero targets, but now it's show us how you're going to get there. And that's where there's a whole new line of cases and focus from the activists on implementation. So it's not about, setting a net zero target, that's 2020, 2021. Now demonstrate to me how you're actually going to get there. So what are your plans for meeting that target? And that's where organisations, particularly for reporting entities, the rubber really hits the road on ensuring that they have a robust approach. And the real issue, there's a capacity gap, I'd say, from the ASX 20 down at the moment, where there may be ambitious targets, but there's just not the internal resource, capability, or hours in the day, frankly, to have a robust process in place. So it's just about doing what you can and ensuring that you're being transparent with the market about the status of where you're up to, what you're still working on, what your next steps are going to be, and ensuring that you're sort of not over disclosing and tying yourself in a few loops there as well. In relation to the Chancery Lane project, thank you, Kat, for asking. So TCLP, as I'll refer to it, is, I think, quite a special organisation for a few reasons. It started with a very simple idea that, and really corporate lawyers asking themselves, what's my role here? What's my role in the climate crisis? I'm sitting here at my desk every day drafting contracts, ensuring that transactions go smoothly, and how are we considering the climate in that process? And so from that little idea that took place in Chancery Lane in the UK, and hence the name of the project, we now have over 2,500 lawyers from 300 organisations who have come together to collaboratively draft climate clauses and also pre-contract tools such as due diligence checklists and sort of tools for RFP phases, governance clauses, and a whole sort of suite of clauses. We now have over 100 clauses, and I think around 30 of those are corporate clauses. And I can talk to a little bit about some of those clauses if we have time. And they're a really helpful tool for a number of reasons, particularly for practitioners who are looking to understand how to integrate climate in particular. So what I will say is TCLP is really focused on, pretty laser focused on net zero and climate issues. We've just released a just transition paper and the consideration of just transition issues in a lot of our content. But really, it's a great starting point for practitioners to be thinking about how they can start to incorporate net zero into the work that they're doing, and in particular, responding to the client need of ensuring that they're covering off the issues with decarbonisation and climate risks in transaction documents. So as I've mentioned, there's model capital markets and just general M&A due diligence questionnaires that are really comprehensive. There's warranties that, you know, flow on directly from those questionnaires. There's, you know, template board minutes and resolutions and, or, you know, great wording that can be used in board papers and resolutions for a significant transaction to ensure that climate risks have been considered. I think what's great about the project is that not the clauses aim to not to completely outweigh commercial and commercial sort of risk return ratios, and that they're clauses that can be used. They're very ambitious, and some of them are probably more ambitious than where the market currently is, but they're what required for us to meet the Paris Agreement goals, which is not looking highly likely at this point in time, but to do what we can to continue to reduce emissions as ambitiously as possible. The other thing I'll mention is that all the clauses, well, I think the project is quite special. They've been drafted collaboratively, which I think is quite a feat for a group of lawyers, but they have been through a really rigorous peer review process. So we've got the top 25 law firms in the UK, all in our peer review network, which and environmental specialists as well, who review all of the clauses before they're published, and they sort of are being, you know, periodically updated as necessary by the community. And there's a couple of local projects going on as well. So please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to be involved. A number of the law firms are involved, not just Minter Ellison, DLA, Klutz, Ashurst, and a few others. So please reach out.
Brilliant. Thank you, Phoebe. So, Andrew, I might then move the conversation your way off the back of Phoebe talking about the Paris Agreement, the fact that some of those clauses and, you know, the goals are pretty ambitious. Where does Australia rate globally in the context of this conversation? What can we learn or expect to see from other jurisdictions? Are we teaching other jurisdictions anything? What does it look like in a global context?
Look, I just, again, it's just the picture is so mixed in terms of certainly in the M&A scenario. I think that, you know, I have seen in terms of inbound M&A, it probably, the climate piece of it probably is well advanced in terms of what I see, particularly out of the US and the EU and the UK. On other parts, probably we're probably a little ahead. I think particularly the kind of Banking Royal Commission, the recent kind of attention off the back of, you know, changes to modern slavery and that kind of an increasing focus on that. So I see local buyers more likely to be interested in those issues than I would on inbound acquisitions. So I guess in terms of, you know, are we leading or following? Probably a bit of both. It's the short answer.
And Phoebe, would you concur with that in terms of what you're seeing come out of your peer review or your conversation with your peers globally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're definitely a few steps behind. I think, you know, that's the gap is kind of slowly closing, particularly with, you know, now we have a very sort of clear federal government policy direction in relation to emissions reduction. So it means that investment in Australian businesses and opportunities in Australia, there's clarity now about the direction of travel if we're thinking about decarbonisation as well, which I think is helping. We're certainly, you know, as I mentioned, a few steps behind, particularly the EU, but a lot of the investment, inbound investment, as Andrew has mentioned, comes from Europe, which means those ESG requirements, particularly climate, where it's a lot more ambitious, particularly in the EU, are already, you know, those investors are already asking those questions and have those elevated expectations. I think the benefit we have here in Australia is that we can look to the other jurisdictions to see what's coming. And so we can, you know, we can understand, you know, the types of frameworks, as you know, Andrew's mentioned, the ISSB sustainability standards that will be that will be brought in Australia. It's been signalled. There's a line item in the budget actually around sustainability reporting. So there's been money allocated to it at the federal level to ensure that that's brought into our own accounting standards. So, you know, that's sort of over the horizon for organisations, and if anyone's on the line sort of works with their reporting or governance teams on those matters. So I think, yeah, we're slowly catching up, and we do benefit from being a little bit behind in that respect. On the risk side, however, we are really, from a physical risk perspective, on climate, we're really at the front line of the climate crisis. We are just due to where we sit relative to the equator and our land mass. You know, currently we're at a 1.1 degree temperature rise globally. That's 1.4 degrees here in Australia. So we're looking at the 2 to 4 degrees global temperature increases globally. That's where we're heading. We've missed 1.5, unfortunately. That's 5 to 6 degrees here in Australia. And in a 2 degree world, we're going to have 50 degree plus days regularly in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. So on the risk side, investing in Australia from a physical risk perspective and the resilience investment that's required, you know, $40 billion a year is required for recovery of, you know, catastrophic weather events. That's something that we don't have on our side, and that we really need to sort of get up the curve on, is how we're embedding resilience into everything that we're doing, because we really, even if we're on the lowest emissions trajectory, those physical risks are going to continue to rise.
Scary stuff. Thank you very much. I'm mindful of the fact that we have approximately 6 minutes left. I will encourage any of the audience who have any additional questions to please pop those into the Q&A chat. We do have opportunity to answer some of those questions, albeit briefly. But by way of wrapping up, I would like to ask each one of you, and Kat, I'll start with you, and then we can kind of go around the houses. Very quickly, in a sort of 1 to 2 minutes, what are your takeaways, top tips for practitioners? What do you think? And Phoebe and Andrew, I'll ask each one of you to answer this in your own way. What would you, suggest to the audience that they sort of take away key tips out of today's conversation? Kat, we're not able to hear you.
Apologies, there has to be one in every call. Look, I think just sort of coming out of the things we've discussed today, you know, is just in terms of how quickly the pace is accelerating, and how quickly, you know, all types of stakeholders, whether it's your shareholders, whether it's your investors, whether it's your customers, you know, whether it's your lenders, how quickly the expectations around this are continuing to ratchet up. So I think it's really a matter of you know, like we said, you know, it's an issue that directors and management and your advisors, you know, need to be live to. And I think one of the aspects to that is, you know, it's not something that you can just leave to the ESG team or to the risk team. You know, I think everyone needs to be literate on these issues, and, you know, really be thinking about how you can integrate this across, you know, all of the work that you're doing, and particularly in a transactional context.
Great, thanks. Andrew, I'm actually going to throw a question to you from one of the audience and ask you to attend to that rather than giving us your takeaway, if that's okay. Have you found that ESG can be, in inverted commas, too complex for clients to understand, especially in the M&A space?
I don't know about too complex. I think that actually Phoebe hit on what I think is the really difficult issue in this space, right? Which is, there's a lot of fuzzy stuff that directors have got to come to grips with, and they've got to pull it all together, and they've got to push out something that essentially is a forward-looking statement, right? And particularly under the Corps Act, that is a very difficult standard, right? Because it wasn't prepared thinking about the fuzzier side of the law or aspirational language, right? It was really driven at looking at financial forecasts, right? And the bit that I am, and I think as lawyers, all of us on the call are going to really struggle with, is talking to clients, particularly directors and officers, about whether they've met that standard, right? Now, ASIC are onto it, and ASIC, there's been a couple of speeches and papers that there are out. But this is a really, really difficult issue to say. What's if I even taking a climate scenario and say, okay, I've run this, looked at this business, and I've got a view about what I think happens to my business in a 5-degree warmer environment. What does it look like? How does it run? Right. But how do I satisfy that I have a reasonable understanding of that, and I've made a reasonable effort in terms of coming up with those forward views? I think it's a big problem. I think ultimately it's a place where there may need to be some law reform, because I just don't think that test works very well. And I suspect, unfortunately, what will happen is there'll be some horrible outlier of somebody who's kind of completely disregarded and said something stupid, and we'll get some not very good law based around a kind of bad fact scenario. And the rest of us who have to live with this stuff day to day are going to have to look at directors and explain to them the gap between that bad decision, the bit like Centro, if you like, right? Which, you took that right out to that point, and you've got to bring day to day back and make calls about what is feasible and what is practical. And I actually was going to use that as the wrap. So it's kind of a good question, because I think that is for us as practitioners who aren't necessarily environmental lawyers, but in sort of M&A kind of world, is really pretty tricky.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And then Phoebe, I think in closing, there is another question from the audience, which I think is a really great one, and also can possibly be used for you to answer what are your key takeaways. David has asked, where should we invest for maximum ESG impact?
Fantastic question, David. I'll add to Andrew's point there as well. I think it's a really valid point and concern, Andrew, around the standard, and particularly for forward-looking statements. And I think we're going to see that evolve, particularly around what is reasonable. And we don't expect directors to have a crystal ball, but just have reasonable grounds and a reasonable basis for making their decisions and disclosures for organisations with that genuine intention. So again, I think that's going to be one of the sort of core issues, and just to reach out to your friendly climate risk governance lawyers when you need specialist advice. So the question from David, I think coming back to the point that Andrew and I discussed around diligence and also what should directors focus on, you'll have the maximum ESG impact without going into too much detail about what we might think that means, if you're tailoring it to your particular organisation and what the goals are for your organisation, and where those biggest risk sort of gaps are and the biggest opportunities are for your organisation. I think I'd link this back to my sort of core point to leave the session on today, which is that ESG is not a compliance issue, and that this is really about evolving financial and liability risks and opportunities. So the maximum ESG impact is going to be where you've taken that really robust and sophisticated approach, as is possible in your circumstances, to understanding what that looks like for your organisation, and just ticking off a list of whether or not you've complied with certain bits of legislation does not cut the mustard anymore with ESG.
Great. That has brought us to time. I'd firstly like to thank all of the participants that have joined. This is my masterclass today. Thank you for being with us. A special thank you to Andrew, Phoebe and Kat for what was a captivating conversation. I know I certainly found it really interesting, and I have no doubt that the audience did too. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a good day further.